You good, bro?
I didn't even get to slur.
Do it again.
I did it again. Okay. Well, hello.
Hi.
It's Pride Month.
Pride.
I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Justina.
And this is
Coffee with the Cocoon.
The Pride Month edition.
Pride.
Woohoo!
Yes.
June.
It is June.
Here we go.
I can't believe that A, this year is flying by this fast, and B, that we're already this far
into summer,
summer, and into this podcast.
Oh yeah.
I don't know.
Is this number 5? I think.
Yeah, I think it's
5 or 6.
So we're
Could
making headway. I'm dyslexic.
It's more than 4.
It is more than 4.
I know we've done 4.
Oh my goodness. But it's coming a long way, and we're doing it.
We're doing the thing.
Exactly.
What are you drinking today? Or what did you drink previously today?
So right now I'm drinking water, but earlier today I had like a mocktail Red Bull energy drink that I just down.
And you tried a new flavor today.
I did. It was like desert prickly pear. It's pretty good.
You fruity girl.
It is Pride.
Well, I opted for a mason jar because it's Pride. Because I'm a queer bitch. Oh, man. I knew I was going to do it.
That's okay.
I drink out of mason jars at home, so it felt very homey to me.
Yeah.
To do the mason jar. I am obviously drinking water, but this morning I had my huge, had the white chocolate raspberry fruity, fruity. So yeah, it's a good day.
It is, and it's a fun day.
Yeah,
because it's
perspectives.
Perspectives.
We'll see. It's fun being queer. It's not fun talking about queer violence, but
it is not.
We'll
but
get there.
That's a great headway into our content warning.
Yes.
Right. So we are going to be talking about interpersonal violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, and specifically violence against LGBTQ individuals.
As we do.
Right.
Yep.
So if this is a time for you to pause, regroup, please feel free to do so. And if you need to come back later, we're on YouTube.
Right.
So take your time.
And feel free, if this is a triggering topic for you, to watch our previous episodes about self-care and resilience.
Absolutely.
Ding, ding, ding.
It's a whole circle.
I can just like Elton John is like, a circle of life. You know?
Yes.
Because it's Pride Month. So
it
Elton,
is.
You know, gay
Elton.
icons.
Did you tell them your Elton John tattoo?
Elton. Yeah. It's his glasses.
Aww.
Gay.
So
we should start a tally of how many times we say gay.
Ooh.
Like,
ding.
Ding.
On it.
Oh, goodness. Well,
we'll actually transition in. We're a little scatterbrained today.
We're excited.
We are, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
The thing about this is that we're meant to have authentic conversations, and it's something that we're both passionate about. And
naturally,
what we're going to do.
Yep.
So I think it's only appropriate to, it seems like common sense to us, but I know it's not the case for everyone. Talk a little bit about the history of Pride. And what that looks like.
Yeah.
Do you want to lead?
Yeah, we will jump in. So I want to say this is when like the Pride movement started.
Yes.
But gay people have existed for all of humanity.
What?
So just putting that out there, just like dropping that in the bucket. Okay. So we're not saying that this is when gay people started to be alive. We're just saying this is when we started fighting for our rights.
Right, in modern
American history. Yes, because unfortunately we don't have all the time to talk about the world history of it.
This is not history class.
This is not history class. This is Coffee the Cocoon. So, yes, the LGBTQ rights movement kind of started with the Stonewall Riot, which was June 28th of what year?
Oh no.
Wait.
How could I do this? Don't put me on Jeopardy. Thank goodness we have phones.
Oh gosh.
I told you we were scatterbrained today. I'm not even gonna guess.
I don't even know. 1969. Yep. Okay, well, so we'll start. Yeah, so we'll start by just talking about like where the LGBTQ rights movement started.
Yeah.
And kind of where Pride Month began, right? So we usually talk about the Stonewall riots at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And that was on June 28th of 1969.
Yes.
So that's why June is Pride Month, is because that riot happened in June, obviously. And I think some misconceptions about that was that a lot of people talk about it as a protest, but it really was a riot. It was meant to be a statement, right?
Yeah.
It was not passive by any means, and it also was violent, unfortunately, and was not. I don't think it was meant to be violent, but that's where it started, right?
Absolutely.
And it kind of led to this modern conversation around what LGBTQ rights look like and how queer people are actively discriminated against by the public and by the police and by each other.
Yep.
So that's where it started,
Yeah.
And I think that's where the conversation kind of starts too.
Right.
And I think we need to give a lot of credit to Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera because they are the ones that really led that movement. And they are trans women of color.
A riot started by trans women of color. That's
wild.
A movement I can get behind.
It's wild. I don't think they get enough credit, even though we talk about it a lot. I think as a community, as a queer community, we talk about it a lot, but I don't think we really acknowledge fully that it was trans women of color.
Right.
Because as we'll talk about in a little bit, trans women of color have the highest rate of violence perpetrated against them.
Yeah.
So I think it really goes to show the strength of those women and what they were willing to do to get their rights.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really where this all starts.
Well, and even after that riot at Stonewall, right, they also were founders of other nonprofits that helped support, I think it's Project Star in the mid-70s that they helped start to support transgender youth who became homeless as a result of them coming out to their families and lack of support and resources. So even after this initial incident, you know, they continued to aspire to bring awareness and justice to themselves, to their community, and to those around them,
and to give back to their community.
Right.
You know, they saw this as a broad spectrum issue, not just a personal issue, which I think was really generous and wonderful of them. And the fights that they had to fight to get there, I think, were really important.
Yes.
Which then brings us up to super modern history, which it's wild that this was 8 years ago now, because it feels like it was just yesterday because it wasn't that long ago. But in the United States, we finally passed the Marriage Equality Act.
Yes.
And that was due to the Supreme Court ruling in 2015. Can you pronounce the names? Because I am
Obergefell versus Hodges.
There we go. Okay. And that Supreme Court ruling was what led to the Marriage Equality Act.
Yes.
And that was a huge step for America.
In the right direction.
Yes. Yes. And nationally, right? Because there were several states that were allowing same-sex marriage.
Yes.
But it was not
federally protected.
Yes. Yes.
As it was not before.
Yes. Yes.
And I think too that like with that, I think a lot of people were just like, oh, great, all the problems are solved.
Wrong.
Try again. You know, and I think that unfortunately led to a lot of conversations of, well, what else could you want? What else could you need? I don't know, basic human rights, decency, affordable care. The list goes on and on.
Yeah.
Affirming care.
Yeah. Anti-discrimination in general.
Weird concepts, I know. However, it started a conversation. And I think that unfortunately when the Marriage Equality Act passed, it was great. And a lot of us were thinking, what's next? And there really wasn't a lot of conversations about what's next. And unfortunately, has backpedaled quite a bit over the last 8 years since that legalization became protected.
Yeah. And I know that even some states are trying to fight back against that act. My partner and I are engaged and are planning to get married next year. And we had quite a few family members that were asking us, if we were going to be able to get married in Ohio. And it wasn't something we had ever even thought about, but it was, the people around us were concerned for that.
Absolutely.
Because I do think that the discrimination hasn't stopped. It's maybe gotten easier to hide, but it hasn't stopped.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that it's all about a conversation around, specifically in this podcast, right? But how do we improve access to basic human rights? How do we engage in conversations that promote not only affirming but accepting our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and non-binary friends? And really, specifically in this realm, how do we have conversations around interpersonal violence and relationships that are in that community? So it's definitely a lot.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of stigma around same-sex domestic violence in general, right? Even if we're just talking about parental or just like civil disputes of any nature, right? When the two parties are of same sex, there's a lot of discrimination.
There is.
And a lot of downplay, especially when it's two women. Again, even if it's a mother and a daughter, I think there is a lot of just misunderstanding around it, and I know we'll get into this in a little bit, but there's also just like legal barriers when it's a same-sex relationship to getting safe justice.
Absolutely. And we know, especially if you've listened to our other podcast episodes, right?
Which we hope you have.
I hope so. That interpersonal violence, right, is a big umbrella term. So we've got like domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking and all those things in between, right? So today I think we're going to talk more specifically about domestic violence and sexual violence, although they are intertwined, kind of breaking them down a little bit separately to help bring some clearer conversations around the respective differences in those two scenarios. However, understanding that individuals of the LGBTQ plus community are more likely to be victimized and less likely to seek resources or have justice.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So keeping that in mind throughout all of the conversations that we have today.
Yeah, because although we won't have the time today to talk about human trafficking and LGBTQ, and maybe we will create another outlet for that, but LGBTQ folks are at an extremely higher risk for human trafficking because they're at a higher risk of homelessness. And then if you add in the intersectionality of people of color that are queer, it's just astronomical.
And I saw a stat earlier today that a large percentage, and I'm not going to try to remember 72%. I don't even think it's that high, but that there is a high number of especially trans individuals that do engage in sex work, whether that is ethical sex work or forced trafficking experiences. And like you said, it all falls into intersectionality between racism, homophobia, systems neglecting resources that are necessary and needed to accommodate LGBTQ plus individuals, and so many more things like that.
Right. Well, and listen, like if we had the time, we'd get into social determinants of health and we'd be here all day long.
All day.
All day long. But everything you just said is related to that, right? Like when all of the systems are failing that individual, many people don't know what else to do except, feel like that's their only option.
Absolutely.
So I guess to kind of get into this whole idea of domestic violence as it pertains to same-sex relationships, I do think that many people don't quite understand the differences and what can be intricate about that and what the specific barriers are and things of that nature. So would you kind of like to start us off on that note and what is unique about same-sex DV?
Yeah. Well, on top of the social stereotypes and stigma that comes with individuals who are engaging in same-sex relationships, I think are a lot of misunderstanding, right, around what that looks like. There's a spectrum when it comes to sexuality. It's not just a gay man and another gay man. Like, there's bisexuality, which is where someone is attracted to both or all genders. There's lesbian, gay, like our normal,
our normal,
average,
yeah, well known,
experiences, but it goes beyond that. And so we have to understand too that individuals are facing discrimination and finding resources and receiving adequate medical care without judgment in a lot of spaces, on top of not even a lot of times having familial support for their relationship, and this isn't, I feel like this is a good point too, like, this isn't just a lifestyle that someone chooses, right? It's far beyond that. And that stigma unfortunately sticks with a lot of individuals who are, in homosexual relationships. And so it's a lot of uncomfortableness. It's a lot of lacking resources and just limited to no supports that are, I don't want to say helpful, but beneficial in getting their care and support, especially when we know all the things that we know around interpersonal violence and tactics that are used by abusers to go with that and just create this chaotic storm.
Yeah. I know a lot of times when we talk about domestic violence specifically, we talk about power and control, right?
Yes.
And in our line of work, there's a power and control wheel for every identity you could ever think of, right? And I think when we talk about power and control in a LGBTQ relationship, something that people don't quite understand is that there's a level of coercion and manipulation around, I'm the only person that'll love you, right? And that sentiment is very hard to overcome mentally, right?
It is.
Because when there are so many sources in the world that reinforce that, it's very hard to overcome it.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm glad that you bring that up too, because I feel like I don't necessarily do direct service. I know that you have limited direct service as well with survivors here in our community, but something that we see and hear on surveys when we're out in the community over and over again is that I can get over the physical violence. It's the verbal abuse, it's the mental terrorizing that sticks with someone far longer, right? So using those coercion tactics, using that manipulation is devastating.
Yes.
On top of experiencing domestic or sexual violence in those situations.
Yeah. And, I know we have a ton of statistics around the percentage of, listen, we'll just tell you, it's a lot, okay?
It is.
There are a lot of folks in the LGBTQ community who are dealing with domestic violence. And a lot of it is psychological, a lot of it is emotional, a lot of it is mental.
A lot of it is financial,
too. Financial, significantly, right? Because again, so many people, there's the there's the lesbian stereotype of on a first date you start planning to move in with each other, right? I think queer folks love very strongly and feel close connections with people very quickly because they don't feel that connection with others very easily, right?
Well, they're able to be more authentic and be more true to themselves when they are in a space where they're not feeling judged, versus in a society that oftentimes opposes or turns a blind eye.
Correct. And so then when we talk about how that can then be used as a manipulation or a coercion or a force situation, to say, well, I'm the only one that loves you, I'm the only one that's going to take care of you, it is extremely hard to get out of relationships where you feel like this is the only option, right? And especially when we're talking about financial abuse, when that person is your entire financial stability.
Yeah.
I mean, in any relationship that is difficult, but especially if we're talking about a trans individual or somebody who is actively discriminated against out in the community, even getting a job can be difficult, right? So then when we're talking about the dependence that somebody has financially, emotionally on another person,
It's a lot.
It's a lot, you know, and it's not fun to think about. So I do want to add in, oh, that's not till later. So goodness, why I'm having a hard time flowing with this. I don't. It's
do
fine.
you
Yeah.
just do whatever you want.
Do you, boo? Yeah, I don't know. I guess, can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen as some barriers with the legal process? Because when somebody does feel like they are able to leave a relationship or to set some boundaries with a partner that is being violent, you know, what have you heard or seen that would create some barriers for those that are trying to seek legal justice?
Absolutely. So I think the first is like, especially when we're talking about domestic violence, when a physical altercation occurs, right? And often I would say that most people do not call, especially those in the LGBTQ plus community, call law enforcement unless it's really, really bad. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, retaliation. Two, will they be believed? And, you know, will they be judged or will they be turned away, if not arrested, for whatever the incident is that's going on, right? And unfortunately, it's really common for individuals to not feel that safety, that security when dispatch is released. It just isn't the most comfortable experience for some. And I think that there has to be some level of accountability too with the violence that has occurred between first responders, specifically law enforcement, and LGBTQ individuals. And I think that there are conversations, especially in this community. I'm not talking about widespread, but in this community about how to improve that. And we're very thankful that that conversation is happening both on and off of our university campus. So I think the first step is that people, there are barriers to calling law enforcement and receiving help that is adequate in getting those cares and necessities met, especially after a physical incident. Another resource that we often see in DV situations is going through the legal system, right? So individuals oftentimes will file for a civil protection order or a CPO, which will probably be spitting out that acronym the rest of this conversation.
like
literally. But that is ultimately like another level of legal protection, or at least feels like that for a number of individuals. There are a lot of objects and sanctions and restrictions and all of those things
stuff I don't understand.
I tried that go into all of those, right? And can truly be protective for not only someone's physical safety but mental and emotional safety. Well, unfortunately, in 2015, you know, the Marriage Equality Act was passed. Previously, gay marriage was not legally, you know, protected. So,
or even recognized
in some states. So filing for a CPO against someone that you're not even supposed to be in a relationship with was nearly impossible without either outing yourself, whether you're, you know, just gay, lesbian, trans, you know, any of those things, outing yourself with possible other negative repercussions from your inner circle or from the community, or legal sanctions, as well as not even oftentimes being able to be heard in front of a judge. Pre-2015. Now there are civil protection orders now that accommodate the federal guidelines for that. However, you know, even I know I can speak mostly to Ohio, but there are still a lot of barriers for individuals getting that type of resource due to discrimination in the legal system, due to oftentimes being discredited for their experiences, which all is unfortunately rooted in that homophobic roots of society as well. I think that when we're talking specifically about lesbian relationships, the idea that a woman can or cannot be an abuser is hard, and is a tricky conversation in general, right? And not just with, you know, gay marriage, but in general, it's a hard conversation. But also, when we're talking about trans individuals coming forward, it's hard when they're not, especially if they haven't legally changed their name, to be using their dead name in those court hearings, and can also be used against them in their proceedings to try to invalidate their experiences in front of a jury.
Well, and especially when we look at historically, being queer, especially having gender dysphoria, even currently, but even more so previously, was seen as a mental disorder. So especially in the legal system, that is still used against folks, right? Especially when we're talking about gender dysphoria and when we're talking about transgender folks, because it literally, you and I both know it used to be a diagnosable disorder, right? It is still currently something to be talked about in a clinical setting, gender dysphoria, but more so for the safety of the person and how to support them, not necessarily to label them as wrong or broken, right? But in the legal system, it is still a barrier and a challenge. And I did just want to echo the fact that I am really proud and grateful for the law enforcement officers that we have in our community, because we have had personal experiences with them that have shown us that they are accepting and willing and happy to work with trans and LGBTQ folks. That is not always true.
Correct.
And so I just want to kind of reinforce that like in our community, we are very grateful to have officers that we work with. But that is not true even outside of our county. So it is something that is a barrier to a lot of folks. And to your point about same-sex relationships between women and how that can be a hard conversation to talk about when it comes to a woman being an abuser. Like you said, I think in any situation that is hard for many people to talk about. And we'll kind of get to that in a second when we talk about masculinity and gender spectrum and and not the politicized gender spectrum, but what it looks like to be a masculine person that is not a man.
Yeah.
Right. And how that can still become an unhealthy situation. But if that's something that folks out there are interested in kind of learning more about or reading about, I read a book a while ago that was really eye-opening when it comes to the thought process when someone is in a domestic violence relationship, but more specifically, someone in a same-sex domestic violence relationship. There was a book that I was reading called In the Dream House, and it was just a really amazing look into, I think a sentiment that we hear a lot is, why did they stay, right? And what was motivating them not to leave, right? And this book was really able to kind of pick that apart. Carmen Maria Machado is the author of that, and it's her personal experience of an interpersonal violence relationship. And it's really amazing because she writes it as if it is kind of a build your own adventure. So she will present a situation and then talk about what would have happened if she had chosen a different path. And it all leads back to itself. And it's just a really interesting look into what her experience was. And I think a very unique one, because we don't get to hear about same-sex relationships very often in this realm, especially firsthand accounts. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, I think it's helpful in our conversations too, right? Like, we wouldn't have to have this conversation if it weren't such a stigmatized topic or a polarizing topic, unfortunately, in today's climate.
Yes.
But it's still a really important and relevant conversation to the work that we do here in advocacy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess that kind of leads us into what sexual violence looks like in same-sex relationships.
Yeah. Ooh, can I backtrack?
Yeah.
Just one.
Yeah.
There was one stat earlier that we looked up that just really, really stuck with me.
Okay.
That I think was a little bit earth-shattering for me.
Okay.
And it was that 14% of the national statistics for domestic violence related homicides were identified as Black trans women.
Yeah.
Just let that sit. Just let that sit.
Yep.
Yeah. And to think that violence against women is already a topic that we are constantly fighting for attention and for to bring awareness to and to justify, and then to hear a stat like that of another marginalized community that faces additional intersectionality hardships is really telling and very moving to the work that we do in this conversation.
Yeah.
So.
And unfortunately, I don't remember what the statistics were, but to that same point, I believe the number was, it's 14% that are killed in an interpersonal violent relationship. But it's only like 6.4% are even in DV, or 6.4% of DV relationships are trans folks. So for 14% of homicides to be trans folks,
yeah,
that's insane. And then to add on to that, I was reading something about the level of discrimination that trans folks face when it comes to law enforcement. So now we've got a group of people that are at a higher risk of lethality and are at a higher risk of discrimination against the systems that are there to help them. Right. So I think that's just really poignant to talk about, because that's why we're here. That's why we're trying to do this work.
Yeah.
Because I think, just to lighten the mood a little bit, I think something that we both are very proud of, and something that drew me to this agency, was that we do not only serve women, and that we serve all folks that are dealing with violence. And I would say a good portion of us here at the Cocoon are in the LGBTQ community. And I think that only elevates our services and allows us to support folks that are also in the community, because when you don't feel represented, you don't reach out.
Well, and we know too, we're getting a lot of calls from other counties and other organizations saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help this person. Right. And it's not at the fault of those other agencies by any means. It's unfortunately just a systematic issue.
Yes.
And those lacking resources, especially in rural Northwest Ohio,
Yep.
And it's definitely a very ongoing issue when it comes to those resources and connecting people to care. Certainly.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess let's dive into sexual violence before we run out of time. Listen, we could talk all day. We're trying to keep it concise. So I actually want to open this conversation up. I know we were going to save this quote for later, but I think it kind of leads us into same-sex sexual violence, because a lot of times when we're talking about same-sex sexual violence, we're talking about male perpetrators against male, right? Because what's interesting when we talk about sexual violence in the LGBTQ community, unlike domestic violence, it is typically not queer people causing harm to other queer people. It is non-LGBTQ folks causing harm to queer folks, right?
Which is deeply embedded in the homophobic roots of a lot of the opposing movements.
Yes. So I pulled my phone out because that quote is right along those lines, right? So I was online the other day and I found this, and I wrote it down like months ago. And when we started talking about this, I was like, this has got to be a part of this conversation. But the quote is, homophobia is men's fear that other men will do to them what they do to women. I'm going to read that again, because it every time I read it, it's just like it hits different, and I just it's really hard to think about, right? So homophobia is men's fear that other men will do to them what they do to women. And I think that really leads us into what sexual violence looks like in the LGBTQ community, and why it is such a struggle, and why so many folks deal with this. Because I think homophobia is at the front end of it, especially when we're talking about male on male perpetration, right? It is astounding the level of fear and stigma that is surrounding sexual violence when it is male on male perpetration. Because I think the sentiment that I have heard a lot just while working here from survivors, from folks in the community, is that a lot of men, cisgendered straight men, don't know how to talk about their sexual violent history because they're worried about people perceiving them as gay. And that in and of itself, unfortunately, is homophobia. And we need to talk about why survivors deserve all the space to talk about their story without being worried that they're going to be perceived as a group of people that are actively being discriminated against.
Mm-hmm. I still have goosebumps. I got goosebumps the first time you read that quote to me, and I still have them. Like, I know you can't see
right.
that, but
yep, yeah. It's a lot,
you know. Is.
And I think that homophobia is at the root of a lot of gender-based violence as it is, but especially when we're talking about sexual violence, it really does come down to fear and misunderstanding and power and control over somebody else. And when we talk about that power and control wheel, there's a section on social class and thinking that your identity is more important than the other person's, right? So when we're talking about a man and a woman and the man perpetrating against the woman, right? A lot of times when we talk about social class, we're talking about the man feeling that his gender role is more powerful, more controlling than the woman's. And when we're talking about a same-sex situation, it is typically a cis straight man perpetrating against an LGBTQ person, right? And so all of those identities, seeing those identities as better or more important or more powerful than the other person's. And that's hard to sit with as it is, right?
Yeah.
And then when we talk about the idea that men are scared to talk about their own sexual violent past because of the fear of being discriminated against because they might be perceived as gay, just adds another level, right? And not that there's anything wrong with having that initial thought, but making sure that you're taking care of yourself and recognizing that your story is separate from a sexual identity.
Absolutely. And, when we talk about individuals in the LGBTQ plus community, there is like a 2.5, they're like 2.5 times more likely to experience sexual victimization than others, right? And that only gets more intensive when there are other factors in that intersectionality between racism and homophobia and other systems and identities that add into that make it even more complicated for someone to not only disclose their experiences and seek justice and healing, but just that initial step of accepting that this happened.
Yeah. And then another sentiment I've heard is the sheer confusion around the idea that when the sexual violence occurred, they did not identify as LGBTQ, and then later in life they did, and how that is it's just a bowl of soup in your head. Like, how do you even piece that out? Like most people have a very hard time weeding through all of that, right? And I think it is even harder for society to really wrap their heads around too. Well, where do we go from here? Because that's a lot, and
it is a lot, but it's a really important aspect of the conversation, though, too, because we know, based off of the newest stats from the CDC, that there has been an increase of male survivors coming forward to disclose their abuse, which is a blessing and a curse, right? Because that means that there are conversations coming through the tunnel about it can happen to anyone, and that it's not at their fault, but also is telling of the reality of sexual violence that is happening across the entire spectrum. And I know that there are even higher rates of victimization and increased risk for individuals who are trans and those things as well. And talking also about not only sexual violence, but STIs and HIV and all of these other I don't want to say side effects. That's not the word I'm looking for.
Repercussions.
That happen, especially after being victimized that are also very stigmatized within the LGBTQ plus community.
Yep.
There could be a whole nother podcast episode about the AIDS epidemic and SV and DV, but we'll put a pin in it.
Deep breath.
It'll be a pin for another topic another day.
Yep.
But I think that the big takeaway too is that violence is never acceptable, regardless of who is, the one receiving it. And unfortunately, the societal standard of men can't be victimized, or they're weak, or they're sensitive, or they asked for it, or they're gay, or whatever that is just a really damaging mindset and only hurts the cause. And I think that this kind of transitions into our big point that we wanted to make today, was that when we tolerate violence against LGBTQ folks, that we are only promoting violence against women. And that, I think, is so telling, based off of not only the facts and the stats that we've gone through, but just the conversations of the discrimination, of the hardship, of the barriers that individuals face. And we say, the violence against women, is something that I think is probably a little bit more in society's front of their view versus LGBTQ individuals. It's easy to unfortunately put that community in the back burner. But when we tolerate violence in one community, we're just promoting it in another. And that's something that we continue, to challenge in our conversations in the community and our education curriculum, and an entire, aspect of the work that you and I do in education and prevention, but also trying to bring awareness to make community change and societal change as well.
Yeah. Because, like we've said many times, we'll add it to another. But when we talk about power and control, right? Like, when you are comfortable with someone exerting power and control over a marginalized group of people, why would that not lead to power and control over women, which is still not as oppressed as we used to be, but still discriminated against, right? So when we, the idea that it's okay to have power and control and tolerate violence against queer folks, but not against women, it there's dissonance there, right? And so it's hard for me to promote anti-violence against women and not promote anti-violence.
They go hand in hand, right? And it goes back to media, like the argument of there's too much representation of LGBTQ folks is wildly inaccurate, because unfortunately, if you look at most of the media where they are present, they have violence afflicted against them, and that continues to promote and fuel that drive of hate and homophobic messages, whether they're intentional or not. The idea of that media and music influence the way that we interact, or our perspective to individuals, similarly to with violence against women. It all goes hand in hand, all the time. That we can't have one conversation and turn a blind eye to the other.
Or we're just continuing to tolerate violence against women.
Right.
And
there's that level of accountability too that has to go into play with systems for those of us that are in advocacy, for those that are in other systems like legal, law enforcement, family services, that have to have some level of accountability and uncomfortable awareness of how their structured policies, their perspectives, and all of those things, influence violence against marginalized and minority communities.
Well, and I think that brings us to a much more hopeful place after that whole conversation, right? Of what do we do now, right? So this podcast is meant to bring awareness, but it's also meant to bring some action and some hope, right? So I think that we are always promoting the idea of having conversations and talking to the people around you, talking to your lawmakers and your law enforcement folks in your life, right? Talk to them about why it's important to not only tolerate LGBTQ folks, but accept them as human beings at the very least, right?
Right.
But also, make sure you're reaching out to the LGBTQ folks in your life. And if you are somebody who may feel that there aren't any in your life, I would re-examine that and try to reach out to those that may not always feel open to it, right? Because there was some statistic I was looking at a long, long time ago, and I wish I remembered what the article was, but it was talking about how homophobia theoretically could be eradicated within our lifetime because anyone can be born, into the LGBTQ community, as compared to racism, where obviously not anybody can be born into a different race, right? And so, in theory, homophobia could be eradicated because it touches anybody, right? Unfortunately, I think there are still a lot of folks that, like you said, turn a blind eye to that and don't always want to acknowledge it. But there was also some quote I was listening to today, but folks in the LGBTQ community chose to be straight before they allowed themselves to come out as their sexuality, right, or their gender. And so I think that is also interesting to think about, that many times LGBTQ folks are not choosing to be queer. At some point in their life, they probably chose to be straight for their own safety, right? And so if that helps you understand where some of us are coming from, I would just sit with that for a little while.
Yeah. This isn't a social media trend. This isn't like a hashtag.
And this isn't new. Remember what I said at the beginning, right? Like, historically, queer folks have been here forever, right? And there are many cultures. Again, we could spend a whole nother don't get us on the pride topic, we'll be here all day. There are so many cultures that even love and accept and cherish their queer folks in their communities. They have very specific and dear roles in those communities, and we have somehow grown to a place to fear those people and to persecute them for their identity, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think something that's really important too is that, like, speaking only for the Cocoon, right, is that for our LGBTQ brothers, sisters, and non-binary pals, we see you and we hear you and we know that you're there, and we're here to serve you too, with that affirming care and to try to meet your needs as best as possible, and I think that that's something that is definitely very different about the Cocoon in comparison to other advocacy centers and emergency shelters and things like that, is that we work with all survivors because we understand that it goes beyond the stereotypical mindset of a man harming a woman, right? And if we're not doing a service to all, we're doing a disservice instead, and so just know that we are here for you, and we see you and we hear you, yeah, I could go on about that for a little bit, but
and I think we'll probably just end with celebrate yourselves this month.
Absolutely. There is a lot of hardship. There are still a lot of ways to go, especially in American society. And I know that there is good headway happening here in our specific community, and that there is headway happening in other places. However, we still have a long way to go. We still have to engage in uncomfortable conversations. But come on, celebrate.
I know.
It's don't get caught up in all the negativity. I know we spend a lot of time talking about that because it's a harsh reality.
Yes. And it needs to be talked about.
Yes, it needs to be.
But we also got to talk about having some fun, being ourselves. Wear your pride shirt to work, okay? Like, do your thing.
Embrace you and be authentically you in every space that you are able to, right?
Yep.
And that's something that the Cocoon aspires to be, is a place where someone can be authentic with themselves and just be their true being.
Yep.
Be
safe.
Absolutely.
But have fun.
Please.
Yeah.
Please have fun. And for our straight allies, step up.
Right.
Come
show
celebrate
up.
With us and show up. Be there. Be present.
Yep. And start talking.
This is about love, and this is about being there for each other and supporting each other and just have a damn good time.
Yep. And that's it.
Cool.
On that note.
I guess cheers.
I got it that time.
Go you.